Question 1. Upon reviewing the results of a PI cognitive assessment administered to a candidate for a leadership role, a hiring manager is considering how to best integrate this information into their decision-making process. The assessment indicated a high aptitude for abstract reasoning and problem solving. The manager is aware that the role requires strong strategic thinking and the ability to navigate complex organizational challenges. Which of the following represents the most professionally sound approach to utilizing the PI cognitive assessment results in this scenario? Option A. The hiring manager should solely rely on the PI cognitive assessment results, as the high score in abstract reasoning and problem solving directly correlates with the requirements for strategic thinking and complex problem navigation in the leadership role. Option B. Hiring manager should use the PI cognitive assessment results to confirm a pre-existing positive impression of the candidate, believing the assessment validates their initial judgment about the candidate's suitability for the role. Option C. The hiring manager should disregard the PI cognitive assessment results, as cognitive assessments are too abstract and do not provide practical insights into a candidate's ability to handle real-world leadership challenges. Option D. The hiring manager should consider the PI cognitive assessment results as a significant indicator of the candidate's potential for strategic thinking and problem solving, but should also weigh these results alongside other critical factors such as the candidate's past performance, leadership experience, and interview responses to form a comprehensive evaluation. Correct answer is D. The hiring manager should consider the PI cognitive assessment results as a significant indicator of the candidate's potential for strategic thinking and problem solving, but should also weigh these results alongside other critical factors such as the candidate's past performance, leadership experience, and interview responses to form a comprehensive evaluation. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply the principles of the PI cognitive assessment within a specific, albeit hypothetical, regulatory context. The core difficulty lies in discerning the appropriate use of such assessment in a decision-making process, ensuring fairness, and avoiding discriminatory practices, all while adhering to the implicit guidelines of a professional assessment framework. Careful judgment is required to balance the utility of the assessment with ethical considerations and the potential for misinterpretation or misuse. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on using the PI cognitive assessment as one component of a broader evaluation, emphasizing the importance of considering multiple factors and avoiding sole reliance on a single data point. This aligns with the ethical principles of responsible assessment, which advocate for a holistic view of an individual's capabilities and potential. It acknowledges that cognitive assessments provide valuable insights, but are not definitive predictors of success or suitability in all contexts. This approach promotes fairness and reduces the risk of bias by integrating the assessment results with other relevant information, such as experience, qualification, and behavioral observations. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the PI cognitive assessment score to make a definitive decision fails to acknowledge the limitations of any single assessment tool. It risks oversimplifying complex human capabilities and may lead to decisions that are not well supported by a comprehensive understanding of the individual. This approach could be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence and professional judgment, potentially leading to unfair outcomes. Another incorrect approach that involves using the PI cognitive assessment to justify pre-existing biases or assumptions is ethically reprehensible. This constitutes a misuse of the assessment tool and undermines its intended purpose. It is a direct violation of professional ethics, which demand objectivity and impartiality in evaluation processes. Such misuse can lead to discriminatory practices and significant reputational damage. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the assessment's purpose and limitation, a commitment to using it as part of a multifaceted evaluation, and a continuous awareness of ethical considerations. Professionals should ask themselves, does this assessment provide relevant information for the decision at hand? Am I considering all other relevant factors? Could my interpretation of this assessment be influenced by bias? Am I using this assessment in a way that is fair and equitable? This systematic approach ensures that assessments are used responsibly and ethically to support sound decision-making. Question 2. During the evaluation of a candidate for a complex analytical role, an assessor reviews the Predictive Index Cognitive Assessment (PICA) results. The candidate scored within the average range for numerical reasoning but slightly below average for verbal reasoning. The role requires strong capabilities in both areas, with a particular emphasis on interpreting complex financial reports. What is the most appropriate next step for the assessor? Option A. Immediately disqualify the candidate due to the below-average verbal reasoning score, as this directly impacts their ability to interpret financial reports. Option B. Focus solely on the numerical reasoning score, assuming it is sufficient for the role given the candidate's average performance in this area. Option C. Interpret the below-average verbal reasoning score as an indication of a general lack of analytical ability and recommend against proceeding with the candidate. Option D. Recommend the candidate for further assessment, focusing on practical exercises that simulate the verbal reasoning demands of the role, and consider the numerical reasoning score in conjunction with the candidate's overall experience and interview performance. The correct answer is D. Recommend the candidate for further assessment, focusing on practical exercises that simulate the verbal reasoning demands of the role, and consider the numerical reasoning score in conjunction with the candidate's overall experience and interview performance. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the assessor to balance the need for objective cognitive assessment with the potential for unconscious bias or misinterpretation of results. The Predictive Index Cognitive Assessment, PICA, is designed to measure an individual's learning ability, critical thinking, and problem-solving skills, which are crucial for job performance. However, the interpretation of these scores is not always straightforward and can be influenced by external factors or the assessor's own perceptions. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the PICA results in conjunction with other relevant information, such as the job requirements, the candidate's experience, and interview performance. This holistic evaluation ensures that the assessment is fair, objective, and predictive of future success. It aligns with best professional practices by avoiding over-reliance on a single data point and by considering the full context of the candidate's profile. This approach minimizes the risk of discriminatory practices and promotes equitable hiring decisions, which are implicitly supported by general principles of fair employment and assessment validity, even without specific regulatory citations for this exam context. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on a specific score or pattern within the PICA results without considering the broader picture. For instance, dismissing a candidate based on a slightly lower than average score in one area without understanding the job's actual demands or the candidate's strengths in other areas is professionally unsound. This could lead to overlooking a highly suitable candidate and potentially introduce bias. Another incorrect approach would be to interpret the PICA results through the lens of preconceived notions about the candidate's background or demographics, rather than objectively assessing their cognitive abilities as measured by the assessment. This would be a direct violation of ethical assessment principles and could lead to discriminatory outcomes. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Understanding the purpose and limitations of the PICA. 2. Clearly defining the cognitive requirements of the role. 3. Objectively analyzing the PICA results against these requirements. 4. Integrating PICA findings with other relevant candidate information. 5. Documenting the rationale for any decisions made based on the assessment. This systematic approach ensures that the assessment process is valid, reliable, and fair. Question 3. Governance review demonstrates that a senior executive's recent PI cognitive assessment results show a lower score in the problem-solving domain compared to previous assessments, despite consistently strong performance reviews and positive peer feedback in their governance role. What is the most appropriate next step for the governance committee? Option A. Use the lower problem-solving score as definitive evidence to question the executive's continued suitability for their current governance responsibilities, and initiate a formal performance improvement plan focused solely on cognitive skills. Option B. Initiate a discussion with the executive to understand potential factors influencing the assessment results and explore if any support or development is needed, while continuing to consider their overall performance and experience. Option C. Immediately recommend the executive for reassignment to a less cognitively demanding role, citing the decline in the problem-solving score as a direct indicator of diminished capacity. Option D. Disregard the PI cognitive assessment results entirely, assuming they are an anomaly, and proceed with the governance review based solely on existing performance metrics and reputation. The correct answer is B. Initiate a discussion with the executive to understand potential factors influencing the assessment results and explore if any support or development is needed, while continuing to consider their overall performance and experience. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an individual's cognitive abilities, as measured by the PI cognitive assessment, are being evaluated in the context of a governance review. The challenge lies in interpreting the assessment results accurately and applying them appropriately within a professional framework, ensuring fairness and compliance. It requires understanding the purpose and limitations of such assessments and avoiding subjective biases or misinterpretations that could lead to unfair outcomes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a nuanced understanding of the PI cognitive assessment role as a tool to identify potential cognitive strengths and areas for development relevant to a role's demands. It emphasizes using the assessment results as one data point among others, such as performance reviews, experience, and observed behaviors, to form a comprehensive picture. This aligns with best professional practice by promoting a holistic and objective evaluation, respecting the individual's overall capabilities, and ensuring that decisions are based on a balanced assessment of all relevant factors. Ethically, this approach upholds principles of fairness and due process. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately concluding that a lower than expected score on a specific subsection of the PI cognitive assessment indicates a fundamental inability to perform the governance role. This is a failure to consider the assessment's limitations and the potential for external factors influencing performance on a given day. It represents an over-reliance on a single data point and a lack of professional judgment, potentially leading to discriminatory or unfair conclusions. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the PI cognitive assessment results entirely because they do not align with pre-existing positive perceptions of the individual's performance. While subjective positive perceptions are valuable, ignoring objective data from a standardized assessment without a valid reason can lead to a failure to identify potential risks or areas where development might be beneficial. This approach can be seen as biased and lacking in due diligence, potentially overlooking critical insights. A third incorrect approach is to use the PI cognitive assessment results to justify predetermined conclusions about the individual's suitability for the role, regardless of other evidence. This demonstrates a lack of objectivity and a failure to engage in a genuine assessment process. It is ethically unsound as it undermines the integrity of the evaluation and can lead to unfair and potentially harmful decisions for the individual. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, understand the purpose and scope of the PI cognitive assessment within the organizational context and the specific role. Second, interpret the results in conjunction with all other available information, seeking to understand patterns and potential implications rather than isolated scores. Third, engage in open and constructive dialogue with the individual, if appropriate, to gain further context. Fourth, ensure that any decisions made are based on a holistic, objective, and fair evaluation, adhering to organizational policies and ethical guidelines. Question 4. Consider a scenario where a manager is reviewing the results of the PI cognitive assessment for a high-performing employee who is being considered for a promotion to a more complex role. The employee's scores indicate a moderate level of ability in one specific cognitive area measured by the assessment. The manager is aware that the new role requires a high degree of proficiency in this area, but the employee has consistently demonstrated strong problem-solving skills and adaptability in their current role, exceeding expectations. The manager needs to decide how to proceed with the promotion recommendation. Which of the following approaches best reflects professional best practice in interpreting and utilizing this assessment data? Option A. Request a re-administration of the PI cognitive assessment immediately, assuming the initial score was an anomaly, without considering other performance indicators. Option B. Recommend the promotion, acknowledging the assessment score but emphasizing the employee's proven track record, adaptability, and potential for development in the new role, suggesting targeted support if needed. Option C. Discuss the assessment score with the employee in a way that implies their cognitive abilities are fixed and unchangeable, potentially discouraging them from pursuing the promotion. Option D. Decline the promotion recommendation solely based on the assessment score, falling below the perceived ideal threshold for the new role, without further consideration of the employee's performance or potential. Correct answer is B. Recommend the promotion, acknowledging the assessment score but emphasizing the employee's proven track record, adaptability, and potential for development in the new role, suggesting targeted support if needed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply the results of a cognitive assessment tool, the PI cognitive assessment, in a context that has significant implications for an individual's career progression. The challenge lies in moving beyond a superficial understanding of the scores to a nuanced interpretation that considers the assessment's purpose, limitations, and the specific role requirements. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the assessment is used as a tool for development and informed decision-making, rather than as a definitive, exclusionary measure. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a holistic and developmental perspective. It involves understanding that the PI cognitive assessment measures cognitive abilities that can be developed, and that scores should be interpreted in conjunction with other relevant information, such as performance history, experience, and developmental goals. This approach aligns with ethical principles of fairness and development, ensuring that individuals are not unfairly disadvantaged by a single assessment, and that the assessment serves to identify areas for growth. It promotes a constructive use of assessment data, focusing on how an individual can be supported to succeed. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on a numerical threshold without considering context or development is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a misapplication of the assessment tool, treating it as an absolute determinant rather than an indicator. Such an approach risks violating ethical principles of fairness and equity by creating arbitrary barriers to advancement. It ignores the potential for growth and development, which is a core tenet of professional development and talent management. Furthermore, it may lead to a failure to identify promising candidates who, with appropriate support, could excel. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal biases to interpret the assessment results is also professionally unacceptable. This introduces subjectivity and potential discrimination, undermining the validity and reliability of the assessment process. It fails to adhere to the principle of objective assessment and can lead to biased decision-making, which is both ethically and potentially legally problematic. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the assessment's purpose and limitations, a commitment to objective interpretation, and a focus on developmental outcomes. Professionals should always consider the assessment as one piece of a larger puzzle, integrating its insights with other relevant data. They should prioritize fairness, equity, and the potential for individual growth, ensuring that assessment tools are used to support informed and ethical decision-making. This involves a continuous learning process about assessment methodologies and their appropriate application. Question 5. The review process indicates that a candidate's PI cognitive assessment results show a pattern of strong logical reasoning, but a lower score in attention to detail when compared to the typical profile for a senior project manager role. Which approach to interpreting these results best aligns with professional best practices for assessment utilization? Option A. Interpret the results based on personal observations during the interview, allowing subjective impressions to outweigh the objective data from the assessment. Option B. Immediately flag the lower attention to detail score as a significant risk, suggesting the candidate is unsuitable for a role that requires meticulous planning and execution. Option C. Prioritize the candidate's overall score against a general benchmark for managerial roles, disregarding the specific nuances of logical reasoning versus attention to detail. Option D. Focus on how the candidate's logical reasoning can be leveraged to strategize and lead complex projects, while acknowledging that attention to detail might require support structures or delegation within the team. The correct answer is D. Focus on how the candidate's logical reasoning can be leveraged to strategize and lead complex projects, while acknowledging that attention to detail might require support structures or delegation within the team. Explanation. The scenario presents a challenge in interpreting the results of a PI cognitive assessment within the context of a specific role's demands, requiring a nuanced understanding of how cognitive abilities translate to job performance. The professional challenge lies in avoiding oversimplification or misapplication of assessment scores, ensuring that the interpretation is fair, objective, and directly relevant to the job requirements without introducing bias. Careful judgment is required to balance the insights from the assessment with other relevant information about the candidate and the role. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a holistic and contextualized interpretation of the PI cognitive assessment results. This approach prioritizes understanding how the candidate's cognitive strengths and potential limitations, as indicated by the assessment, align with the specific demands and complexities of the role. It emphasizes the need to consider the assessment as one piece of a larger puzzle, integrating it with other data points such as experience, interview performance, and behavioral observations. This aligns with ethical guidelines for assessment use, which mandate that interpretations are relevant to the purpose for which the assessment was administered, and that conclusions are supported by evidence. It avoids making definitive judgments based solely on a single data point, and instead focuses on identifying potential areas of strength and development in relation to the job. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on matching raw scores to predefined benchmarks without considering the specific nuances of the role fails to acknowledge the contextual nature of cognitive abilities. This can lead to misinterpretations, where a candidate might appear to be a poor fit based on a rigid score comparison, even if their cognitive profile is well suited to the actual tasks and challenges of the position. This approach risks introducing bias by not accounting for individual differences and the varied ways cognitive skills can be applied. Another incorrect approach that relies heavily on anecdotal evidence or personal biases to interpret the assessment results is ethically unsound and professionally unacceptable. This bypasses the objective data provided by the PI cognitive assessment and introduces subjective judgment, which can lead to discriminatory outcomes. It fails to uphold the principles of fairness and objectivity in assessment interpretation. A further incorrect approach that dismisses the PI cognitive assessment results entirely due to a single perceived anomaly, without further investigation or consideration of the overall profile, is also professionally flawed. This can lead to overlooking valuable insights into a candidate's cognitive capabilities that are relevant to job performance. It represents a failure to utilize the assessment tool appropriately and to conduct a thorough, evidence-based evaluation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Clearly define the cognitive requirements of the role. 2. Administer the PI cognitive assessment as per established protocols. 3. Interpret the assessment results in the context of the defined role requirements, considering both strengths and potential areas for development. 4. Integrate the assessment findings with other relevant candidate information, e.g., resume interview references. 5. Formulate conclusions based on a comprehensive review of all available data, focusing on the candidate's potential to succeed in the specific role. 6. Document the interpretation and the rationale for any decisions made. Question 6. Which approach would be most effective in utilizing the insights from a PI cognitive assessment predictive index cognitive assessment to inform hiring decisions, by comparing its predictive capabilities against other conceptual frameworks for understanding cognitive aptitude in relation to job success? Option A. Focusing exclusively on the historical job performance data of past employees without considering their cognitive assessment profiles or the specific demands of the role. Option B. Conducting a comparative analysis of how the PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment's predictive validity for job performance stacks up against theoretical models of cognitive ability and their application in similar roles. Option C. Relying primarily on the subjective evaluations of hiring managers regarding a candidate's perceived intelligence and problem-solving skills, irrespective of formal assessment results. Option D. Attempting to establish a direct correlation between PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment scores and demographic characteristics of successful employees, without a validated theoretical basis. The correct answer is B. Conducting a comparative analysis of how the PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment's predictive validity for job performance stacks up against theoretical models of cognitive ability and their application in similar roles. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of how different cognitive assessment methodologies can be interpreted and applied within a specific organizational context, particularly when aiming to predict future job performance. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate assessment approach that aligns with the stated goals of the PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment, while also considering the potential for misinterpretation or misapplication of results. Careful judgment is required to ensure the chosen approach is both valid and ethically sound. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core purpose of the PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment, which is to provide insights into an individual's cognitive abilities relevant to job performance. This approach emphasizes a comparative analysis of how different assessment methodologies, including the PI itself, might be used to predict success in a role. It acknowledges that while the PI is a specific tool, understanding its strengths and limitations in comparison to other conceptual approaches to cognitive assessment is crucial for informed decision-making. This aligns with professional standards that advocate for the use of validated assessment tools and a thorough understanding of their predictive validity in the context of the specific roles being evaluated. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the historical performance of individuals without considering their cognitive profiles would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to leverage the predictive power of cognitive assessments, which is the explicit aim of the PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment. It represents a failure to adhere to best practices in talent assessment by relying on potentially biased or incomplete data. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes subjective manager opinions over objective assessment data would also be professionally unacceptable. This introduces significant bias and undermines the scientific rigor that cognitive assessments are designed to provide. It deviates from ethical guidelines that promote fair and objective evaluation processes. A third incorrect approach that attempts to correlate assessment results with demographic data without a clear theoretical or empirical link would be professionally unsound. This risks creating discriminatory practices and misinterpreting correlations as causation, which is a violation of ethical assessment principles and potentially legal frameworks governing employment. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear definition of the assessment's objectives, a thorough understanding of the available assessment tools and their psychometric properties, and a critical evaluation of how each tool or approach aligns with those objectives. Professionals must consider the potential for bias, the ethical implications of their choices, and the need for objective, evidence-based decision-making. This involves a continuous learning process to stay abreast of best practices in cognitive assessment and talent management. Question 7. The risk matrix shows a candidate's PI cognitive assessment results indicating a lower than average score in a specific reasoning area. Considering the PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment framework, which of the following approaches best reflects professional practice when interpreting these results in the context of a potential role? Option A. Attempt to provide the candidate with specific strategies to study for the PI cognitive assessment to improve their scores before a final evaluation. Option B. Use the PI cognitive assessment results as a primary indicator to immediately rule out the candidate for roles requiring that specific reasoning area, assuming a direct correlation with performance limitations. Option C. Interpret the lower score as a definitive sign of the candidate's inability to learn or adapt in any professional setting, regardless of the role's specific demands. Option D. Integrate the PI cognitive assessment results into a broader evaluation, considering them alongside other relevant information such as experience, interview performance, and specific job requirements, to understand potential strengths and areas for development. The correct answer is B. Use the PI cognitive assessment results as a primary indicator to immediately rule out the candidate for roles requiring that specific reasoning area, assuming a direct correlation with performance limitations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply cognitive assessment results within a specific regulatory context, without overstepping the boundaries of their role or misinterpreting the data. The challenge lies in understanding the nuances of the PI cognitive assessment's purpose and limitations, and how its results should inform, but not dictate, decision-making, especially when potential biases or misinterpretations could arise. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the assessment is used ethically and effectively, adhering strictly to the guidelines of the PI Cognitive Assessment Predictive Index cognitive assessment framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it acknowledges the PI cognitive assessment as a tool for understanding an individual's cognitive abilities and potential, rather than a definitive measure of suitability or a basis for discriminatory action. It emphasizes using the assessment results to inform a broader, holistic evaluation, which aligns with ethical principles of fair assessment and individual consideration. This approach respects the assessment's intended use and avoids making absolute judgments based solely on cognitive scores, thereby preventing potential misapplication and ensuring a fair process. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the numerical scores of the PI cognitive assessment to immediately disqualify a candidate would be a regulatory and ethical failure. This is because the PI cognitive assessment is designed to measure cognitive capacity, not to be a sole determinant of job performance or suitability. Such an approach could lead to discrimination based on cognitive profiles, which is contrary to fair employment practices and the spirit of using assessments as developmental or informational tools. Another incorrect approach that involves attempting to coach a candidate on how to improve their PI cognitive assessment scores before a formal assessment would also be an ethical failure. This constitutes an attempt to manipulate the assessment process, undermining its validity and fairness. It violates the principle of objective assessment and could lead to inaccurate data being used for decision-making. A third incorrect approach that involves using the PI cognitive assessment results to make assumptions about an individual's personality or behavioral traits beyond what the assessment is designed to measure would be a misapplication of the tool. The PI cognitive assessment is focused on cognitive reasoning abilities, and extrapolating beyond this scope can lead to flawed conclusions and unfair judgments. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the assessment's purpose, its limitations, and the relevant regulatory framework. Professionals must always strive for objectivity, fairness, and a holistic evaluation of individuals. Using assessment data as one piece of information among many, they should consult assessment guidelines and ethical codes to ensure their practices are sound and compliant. Question 8. Research into the application of cognitive assessments in talent selection suggests that interpreting PI cognitive assessment results requires careful consideration of the specific job role. A hiring manager is reviewing candidates for a complex analytical role that demands strong problem-solving and strategic thinking abilities. They have received the PI cognitive assessment reports for several candidates. Which of the following approaches best reflects a responsible and effective use of this assessment data in the decision-making process? Option A. Analyzing the PI cognitive assessment scores in conjunction with a detailed understanding of the cognitive demands inherent in the target analytical role to identify candidates whose cognitive abilities are likely to support success in that specific position. Option B. Focusing solely on candidates who achieve the highest raw scores on the PI cognitive assessment, assuming that higher scores universally equate to superior job performance across all roles. Option C. Utilizing the PI cognitive assessment results to assess candidates' interpersonal skills and leadership potential, as these are often important for success in analytical roles. Option D. Disregarding the PI cognitive assessment results entirely, as the manager prefers to rely exclusively on traditional interview techniques and resume reviews for candidate evaluation. The correct answer is A. Analyzing the PI cognitive assessment scores in conjunction with a detailed understanding of the cognitive demands inherent in the target analytical role to identify candidates whose cognitive abilities are likely to support success in that specific position. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply the results of a cognitive assessment tool, the PI cognitive assessment, within a specific organizational context. The challenge lies in moving beyond a superficial understanding of the scores to a nuanced interpretation that considers the role's demands and the individual's potential fit, while adhering strictly to the assessment's intended use and ethical guidelines. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpretation, bias, or inappropriate application of the assessment results, which could lead to discriminatory practices or ineffective hiring decisions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a holistic and context-aware interpretation of the PI cognitive assessment results. This involves understanding that the assessment measures cognitive abilities relevant to job performance, and then integrating these insights with a thorough understanding of the specific role's requirements. This approach aligns with the ethical principles of using assessments responsibly, ensuring fairness, and making decisions based on job-related criteria. It avoids over-reliance on a single data point and promotes a balanced evaluation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on raw scores without considering the role's specific cognitive demands fails to recognize the purpose of the PI cognitive assessment, which is to predict job performance. This can lead to overlooking potentially suitable candidates who might score slightly lower but possess other critical attributes, or conversely, selecting candidates who score high but are not a good fit for the actual tasks. This approach risks violating principles of fairness and validity in assessment. Another incorrect approach that uses the PI cognitive assessment results to infer personality traits or non-cognitive abilities is a fundamental misapplication of the tool. PI cognitive assessment is designed to measure cognitive capacity, not personality. Using it for purposes outside its validated scope can lead to inaccurate conclusions, biased decision-making, and potentially discriminatory outcomes, as it moves away from job-related competencies. A further incorrect approach that dismisses the PI cognitive assessment results entirely due to a preference for other selection methods, ignores the potential value of a scientifically validated tool. While multiple assessment methods are often beneficial, completely disregarding a tool designed to measure relevant cognitive abilities without a justifiable, evidence-based reason is unprofessional and can lead to suboptimal hiring decisions by omitting a key dimension of candidate evaluation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the assessment's purpose and limitations. Recognize what the PI cognitive assessment measures and what it does not. 2. Define role requirements. Clearly articulate the cognitive demands of the position. 3. Integrate assessment data with other relevant information. Combine PI results with interviews, experience, and other valid selection tools. 4. Focus on predictive validity. Ensure that the interpretation and application of the assessment are linked to predicting job success. 5. Maintain ethical standards. Avoid bias, ensure fairness, and use the assessment only for its intended purpose. 6. Document the decision-making process. Keep records of how assessment data was used in conjunction with other factors. Question 9. Examination of the data shows that an individual has achieved a specific score on the PI cognitive assessment. This score indicates a particular cognitive profile. When considering this individual for a role that involves complex problem-solving under time pressure and requires meticulous attention to detail, what is the most appropriate next step in assessing their suitability and potential risks? Option A. Interpret the scores based on general assumptions about cognitive abilities, without reference to the specific job requirements or potential risks. Option B. Share the raw assessment scores with all team members to gather their informal opinions on the candidate's cognitive abilities. Option C. Evaluate the cognitive profile against the specific demands and inherent risks of the role to identify potential areas of strength and concern for performance and safety. Option D. Immediately conclude that the score is sufficient or insufficient for the role based solely on the numerical value. The correct answer is C. Evaluate the cognitive profile against the specific demands and inherent risks of the role to identify potential areas of strength and concern for performance and safety. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret cognitive assessment results in the context of a specific role's demands, while simultaneously adhering to ethical guidelines regarding the appropriate use and interpretation of such assessments. The challenge lies in moving beyond a superficial understanding of the scores to a nuanced evaluation of their implications for job performance and potential risks, all within the confines of regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a holistic risk assessment. This means considering the PI cognitive assessment results not in isolation, but in conjunction with the specific requirements and inherent risks of the role. It necessitates understanding that a cognitive assessment is a tool to gauge potential, not a definitive predictor of future behavior or performance. By evaluating the potential impact of cognitive strengths and weaknesses against the demands of the position, one can proactively identify areas where support might be needed or where certain tasks might pose a higher risk. This aligns with the ethical imperative to use assessments responsibly and to ensure that decisions based on them are fair, valid, and contribute to a safe and effective working environment. It also implicitly acknowledges the limitations of any single assessment tool and the need for broader contextual understanding. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the numerical scores without considering the role's context fails to meet professional standards. It risks misinterpreting the data, leading to potentially unfair or discriminatory decisions. For example, a high score in one area might be irrelevant to the core functions of the role, while a moderate score in another might be critical. Without contextualization, this approach can lead to overlooking crucial performance indicators or overemphasizing less important ones. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal biases to interpret the assessment results is ethically unsound and professionally negligent. This bypasses the objective data provided by the assessment and introduces subjective, potentially discriminatory, factors into the decision-making process. It undermines the validity of the assessment and can lead to biased outcomes, violating principles of fairness and objectivity. A third incorrect approach that involves sharing the raw assessment data broadly without proper context or justification is a breach of confidentiality and professional ethics. Assessment results are sensitive information and should only be shared with authorized individuals for legitimate purposes, with appropriate safeguards in place to protect privacy. Professional decision-making process for similar situation should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the purpose of the assessment and the specific role requirements. 2. Analyze the PI cognitive assessment results in the context of those requirements, identifying potential strengths and areas for development or concern. 3. Consider the inherent risks associated with the role and how cognitive abilities might influence the management of those risks. Formulate a comprehensive risk assessment that integrates assessment data with role demands and potential risk factors. 5. Document the assessment and the rationale for any subsequent decisions or recommendations clearly and objectively. 6. Ensure all actions taken are compliant with relevant regulations and ethical guidelines, prioritizing fairness, validity, and confidentiality. Question 10. To address the challenge of assessing a candidate for whom you have a pre-existing personal relationship, how should you interpret the results of the PI cognitive assessment to ensure fairness and accuracy? Option A. Disregard the PI cognitive assessment results entirely and rely solely on your personal observations and prior knowledge of the candidate's performance. Option B. Interpret the PI cognitive assessment results strictly according to the standardized scoring and interpretation guidelines, without allowing personal familiarity to influence the evaluation. Option C. Allow your personal knowledge of the candidate's strengths and weaknesses to subtly adjust the interpretation of the assessment results to align with your existing impressions. Option D. Focus on aspects of the PI cognitive assessment results that confirm your pre-existing positive or negative opinions of the candidate, while downplaying contradictory findings. The correct answer is B. Interpret the PI cognitive assessment results strictly according to the standardized scoring and interpretation guidelines, without allowing personal familiarity to influence the evaluation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for objective assessment with the potential for unconscious bias to influence interpretation. The PI cognitive assessment is designed to measure cognitive abilities, and its results are intended to be used for objective decision-making. However, the assessor's personal familiarity with a candidate can introduce subjective elements, potentially leading to a misinterpretation of the assessment results or an undue weighting of personal impressions over the data. This can compromise the integrity of the assessment process and lead to unfair or inaccurate outcomes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the established protocols for administering and interpreting the PI cognitive assessment, regardless of personal acquaintance with the candidate. This means focusing solely on the standardized scoring and interpretation guidelines provided by the Predictive Index. This approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the principles of fairness, objectivity, and validity in assessment. By relying on the established psychometric properties of the assessment and avoiding personal bias, the assessor ensures that the results are interpreted in a manner consistent with the assessment's intended purpose and that all candidates are evaluated on a level playing field. This aligns with ethical guidelines for assessment professionals, which emphasize impartiality and data-driven decision-making. Correct approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to allow personal knowledge of the candidate to influence the interpretation of the assessment results, perhaps by downplaying areas of weakness or overemphasizing areas of strength based on prior impressions. This is professionally unacceptable because it introduces bias, undermining the validity of the assessment, and potentially leading to an inaccurate evaluation of the candidate's true cognitive abilities. It violates the ethical principle of objectivity and can result in unfair treatment of the candidate. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the PI cognitive assessment results entirely due to the personal acquaintance, relying solely on pre-existing perceptions. This is also professionally unacceptable, as it negates the purpose of using a standardized assessment tool. It represents a failure to utilize a validated measure and an abdication of professional responsibility to conduct a thorough and objective evaluation. This approach is ethically flawed as it prioritizes personal opinion over empirical data. A further incorrect approach would be to subtly adjust the interpretation of the results to align with a pre-existing positive or negative opinion of the candidate, without explicit acknowledgement of this bias. This is a form of confirmation bias and is professionally unethical. It compromises the integrity of the assessment process and can lead to discriminatory practices, as the evaluation is no longer based on objective evidence but on subjective, potentially unfounded personal judgments. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with this situation should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes objectivity and adherence to established protocols. This involves 1. Recognizing the potential for bias when assessing individuals known personally. 2. Committing to a strict interpretation of the assessment results based solely on the provided guidelines and psychometric data. 3. Documenting the interpretation process, including any considerations made regarding the potential for bias. 4. Seeking a second opinion or peer review if there is any doubt about the objectivity of the interpretation. 5. Prioritizing the integrity of the assessment process and the fair treatment of all candidates above personal relationships or pre-existing opinions. Question 11. What factors determine the appropriate application and interpretation of the PI cognitive assessment in a professional selection context, ensuring compliance with principles of fair and objective evaluation? Option A. The assessment's ability to measure general intelligence across all possible domains, irrespective of the specific job role. Option B. The memorization of specific question patterns and the ability to recall answers from previous administrations of the assessment. Option C. The assessment's designed to measure cognitive abilities relevant to the specific job requirements and the standardized administration and interpretation of results. Option D. The perceived difficulty level of the assessment questions and the average time taken by candidates to complete the assessment. The correct answer is C. The assessment's designed to measure cognitive abilities relevant to the specific job requirements and the standardized administration and interpretation of results. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply the principles of the PI cognitive assessment within a specific, albeit implied, professional context, without resorting to mathematical calculations. The core difficulty lies in understanding how the assessment's design and purpose align with regulatory expectations for fair and objective evaluation, particularly when considering potential biases or misinterpretations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on the inherent nature of the PI cognitive assessment as a tool designed to measure cognitive abilities relevant to job performance. Adhering to the assessment's intended use, ensuring proper administration, and interpreting results within the context of the role's requirements are paramount. This aligns with the ethical obligation to use assessment tools responsibly and to avoid discriminatory practices, which are implicitly governed by general principles of fairness and validity in professional assessment, even without explicit mention of specific regulations for this exam. The emphasis is on understanding the purpose and application of the assessment, not on its statistical properties or scoring mechanisms. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the difficulty of the questions or the speed of completion without considering the assessment's validity for the specific role fails to acknowledge the regulatory expectation of using appropriate and job-relevant assessment tools. This could lead to a discriminatory outcome if individuals are screened out based on factors unrelated to their ability to perform the job. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes memorizing specific question types or patterns ignores the assessment's design to measure underlying cognitive abilities rather than rote learning. This would undermine the assessment's purpose and could lead to individuals being selected who do not possess the required cognitive skills. A third incorrect approach that assumes the assessment is a definitive measure of overall intelligence, irrespective of the job context, is also flawed. Assessments are designed for specific purposes, and their validity is tied to the context in which they are used. Misapplying the results outside of this context is a failure of professional judgment and could lead to inappropriate hiring decisions. The professional reasoning process should involve understanding the purpose of the PI cognitive assessment as a measure of cognitive aptitude for a specific role. This includes considering the assessment's validity for that role, ensuring fair and standardized administration, and interpreting results in conjunction with other relevant information about the candidate. Professionals must always consider the ethical implications of assessment use, ensuring that the process is fair, objective, and free from bias, thereby upholding the integrity of the selection process. Question 12. Process analysis reveals that a candidate for a critical project management role has achieved a score on the PI cognitive assessment that is below the average for individuals successfully performing similar roles. However, the candidate possesses extensive experience in managing complex projects and has a strong track record of successful delivery. The hiring manager is under significant pressure to fill the position quickly. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Disregard the PI cognitive assessment score entirely and proceed with hiring the candidate based solely on their extensive experience, assuming that practical experience will compensate for any perceived cognitive limitations. Option B. Interpret the PI cognitive assessment score as a reflection of the candidate's overall aptitude and potential for growth, and proceed with hiring them without further assessment, assuming their experience will be sufficient to overcome any initial cognitive challenges. Option C. Immediately reject the candidate based on the PI cognitive assessment score, as it indicates a potential deficit in the cognitive abilities required for the role, and prioritize candidates who score within the average range. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the candidate's experience and project portfolio, and consider the PI cognitive assessment score as one data point among others, seeking further qualitative information to assess their problem-solving and decision-making capabilities in the context of the specific role's demands. Correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the candidate's experience and project portfolio, and consider the PI cognitive assessment score as one data point among others, seeking further qualitative information to assess their problem-solving and decision-making capabilities in the context of the specific role's demands. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an individual's cognitive abilities, as measured by the PI cognitive assessment, are being evaluated for a role that requires complex problem-solving and decision-making. The challenge lies in interpreting the assessment results accurately and applying them ethically and legally within the context of hiring decisions, ensuring fairness and avoiding bias. The pressure to fill a critical role quickly can tempt shortcuts, but adherence to regulatory frameworks is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a holistic review of the PI cognitive assessment results in conjunction with other relevant information. This includes considering the specific requirements of the role, the candidate's experience, and any other objective data available. This method aligns with best professional practices by ensuring that the assessment is used as one tool among many, rather than the sole determinant of suitability. It respects the principle of fair evaluation and avoids over-reliance on a single data point, which could lead to discriminatory outcomes or misjudgment of a candidate's potential. Ethically, it promotes a comprehensive understanding of the candidate. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on the PI cognitive assessment score to disqualify a candidate, especially if the score is below a predetermined threshold, without considering the context of the role or other mitigating factors. This fails to acknowledge that cognitive assessments are indicators, not absolute predictors, and can be influenced by various external factors. It risks violating principles of fairness and could lead to a discriminatory hiring practice if the threshold is not demonstrably job-related and essential. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the PI cognitive assessment results entirely, assuming that experience alone is sufficient. This disregards a potentially valuable data point that can offer insights into a candidate's capacity for learning, problem solving, and adaptability, which are crucial for many roles. Ethically, it represents a failure to utilize all available, relevant, and validated assessment tools to make an informed decision. A third incorrect approach is to interpret the PI cognitive assessment results in a biased manner, attributing lower scores to personal characteristics rather than cognitive processing ability, or conversely, overemphasizing high scores without considering potential overqualification or fit. This is a direct ethical failure, leading to subjective and potentially discriminatory decision-making, undermining the integrity of the assessment process. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach candidate evaluations using a structured, multifaceted process. This involves clearly defining the essential cognitive requirements for the role, selecting appropriate and validated assessment tools, and interpreting results within the broader context of the candidate's qualifications and experience. Decisions should be based on objective evidence and a clear rationale, with a commitment to fairness, equity, and compliance with all relevant employment laws and ethical guidelines. When in doubt, seeking guidance from HR or legal counsel is advisable. Question 13. The assessment process reveals that a candidate's scores on the PI cognitive assessment indicate a lower than expected aptitude for complex problem solving, yet during interviews and practical exercises, they consistently demonstrate strong analytical skills and provide insightful solutions. What is the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Immediately disqualify the candidate based on the PI cognitive assessment results, assuming the assessment accurately reflects their limitations. Option B. Initiate a further review that includes direct observation of the candidate performing tasks requiring complex problem solving, gathering feedback from interviewers and exercise facilitators, and discussing the assessment results with the candidate to explore potential contributing factors. Option C. Disregard the PI cognitive assessment results entirely and proceed with the candidate based solely on their interview performance and practical exercise outcomes. Option D. Accept the candidate's self-reported confidence in their problem-solving abilities as sufficient evidence to override the PI cognitive assessment findings without further investigation. Correct answer is B. Initiate a further review that includes direct observation of the candidate performing tasks requiring complex problem solving, gathering feedback from interviewers and exercise facilitators, and discussing the assessment results with the candidate to explore potential contributing factors. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an individual's cognitive assessment results, specifically from the PI cognitive assessment, appear to contradict their practical performance and stated capabilities. The challenge lies in interpreting these discrepancies responsibly, ensuring fairness to the individual while upholding the integrity of the assessment process and adhering to professional standards. It requires a nuanced understanding that cognitive assessments are one tool among many and should not be the sole determinant of an individual's potential or suitability. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted review that acknowledges the PI cognitive assessment results, but does not treat them as definitive or immutable. This approach prioritizes a holistic evaluation by seeking further information, such as direct observation of performance in relevant tasks, gathering feedback from supervisors or peers, and potentially discussing the results with the individual to understand their perspective and any external factors that might be influencing their performance or assessment scores. This aligns with best professional practice by ensuring a fair and comprehensive evaluation, minimizing the risk of misinterpretation or bias, and adhering to ethical principles of individual assessment that advocate for considering all relevant evidence. It avoids making premature judgments based on a single data point. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately dismiss the individual based solely on the PI cognitive assessment results, assuming the assessment is infallible and accurately reflects a permanent deficit. This fails to acknowledge the potential for situational factors affecting assessment performance, the limitations of any single assessment tool, and the ethical imperative to provide a fair opportunity for individuals to demonstrate their capabilities through multiple means. It risks violating principles of fairness and potentially discriminatory practices by relying on a narrow interpretation of data. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the PI cognitive assessment results entirely, treating them as irrelevant noise. This is professionally unsound as it disregards a data point that, while not definitive, was gathered through a standardized process intended to measure cognitive abilities relevant to job performance. Ignoring such data can lead to suboptimal decision-making by failing to consider all available information, potentially overlooking genuine areas for development or support that the assessment might have highlighted. It also undermines the purpose and validity of using such assessments in the first place. A third incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on the individual's stated confidence in their abilities, overriding the assessment findings without further investigation. While confidence is important, it does not substitute for demonstrated cognitive capacity. This approach fails to engage with the objective data provided by the assessment and can lead to placing individuals in roles where they may struggle, ultimately to their detriment and the detriment of the organization. It bypasses the professional responsibility to critically evaluate all information. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such discrepancies with a framework that emphasizes critical thinking, data triangulation, and ethical considerations. The process involves 1. Acknowledging all data points, including assessment results and observed performance. 2. Seeking to understand the context and potential reasons for any divergence between different data sources. 3. Employing a variety of evaluation methods to gain a comprehensive picture. 4. Engaging in open and fair communication with the individual. 5. Making decisions based on a balanced and well-supported assessment of all available evidence, rather than relying on a single, potentially misinterpreted piece of information. This systematic approach ensures fairness, accuracy, and adherence to professional and ethical standards. Question 14. Market research demonstrates that the PI cognitive assessment is a valuable tool for understanding an individual's cognitive capacity. In a regulated environment where the assessment is used for employment decisions, which of the following best reflects the appropriate and compliant application of its results? Option A. Utilizing the assessment results as one component of a comprehensive evaluation, alongside other job-related information, to understand an individual's potential to learn and problem-solve in the context of specific job requirements. Option B. Using the assessment results to make assumptions about an individual's personality, work ethic, or interpersonal skills, which are not directly measured by the assessment. Option C. Disregarding the PI cognitive assessment results entirely, as they are perceived as too abstract to be practically useful in making hiring decisions. Option D. Drawing definitive conclusions about an individual's long-term career success and leadership potential, based solely on their score on the PI cognitive assessment. Correct answer is A. Utilizing the assessment results as one component of a comprehensive evaluation, alongside other job-related information, to understand an individual's potential to learn and problem-solve in the context of specific job requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply the principles of the PI cognitive assessment within a specific, regulated context, without resorting to mathematical calculations. The core difficulty lies in understanding how the assessment's outcomes should inform decision-making in a way that aligns with regulatory expectations for fair and objective evaluation, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive information. Careful judgment is needed to ensure that the application of assessment results is ethical and compliant, avoiding any misinterpretation or misuse that could lead to discriminatory practices or regulatory breaches. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on using the PI cognitive assessment as a tool to understand an individual's cognitive abilities in relation to job requirements, as intended by the assessment's design and regulatory guidelines for its use. This involves a holistic review of the results in conjunction with other relevant job-related information, ensuring that any conclusions drawn are objective, job-relevant, and do not rely on assumptions or biases. This aligns with the principle of using assessments to identify potential and suitability for a role in a fair and transparent manner, as often mandated by employment law and professional assessment standards. An incorrect approach that relies on making definitive judgments about an individual's future performance solely based on a single cognitive score, without considering other factors or the assessment's limitations, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This can lead to discriminatory outcomes, violating equal opportunity laws and professional codes of conduct. Another incorrect approach, such as using the assessment results to infer personality traits or non-job-related characteristics, is also a failure. This misinterprets the purpose of a cognitive assessment and can lead to biased decision-making, potentially violating privacy regulations and ethical guidelines for psychological assessment. Furthermore, an approach that ignores the assessment results entirely, despite their potential relevance to job performance, could be seen as a failure to conduct a thorough and objective evaluation, potentially leading to suboptimal hiring decisions and a lack of due diligence. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the assessment's purpose and limitations, a commitment to using assessment data ethically and responsibly, and a focus on job-relatedness. Professionals should always consider the assessment results within the broader context of the role and the individual's qualifications, seeking to understand how cognitive abilities might support or hinder performance. They must also be aware of and adhere to all applicable regulations and ethical guidelines governing the use of assessments in employment decisions. When in doubt, seeking guidance from HR, legal counsel, or assessment experts is a crucial step in ensuring compliance and best practice. Question 15. Implementation of the PI cognitive assessment in a candidate selection process requires careful consideration of its role within the overall evaluation strategy to ensure fairness and compliance. Which of the following approaches best reflects responsible and compliant use of this assessment tool? Option A. Making hiring decisions exclusively based on the PI cognitive assessment scores, assuming the tool accurately predicts job performance for all candidates. Option B. Sharing raw PI cognitive assessment scores with all hiring managers and team members without specific training on interpretation or data privacy protocols. Option C. Disregarding the PI cognitive assessment results entirely after administration, as it is considered an unreliable predictor of success in any role. Option D. Using the PI cognitive assessment as one component of a multifaceted evaluation, alongside interviews and reference checks, with results interpreted by trained personnel and integrated into a holistic assessment of candidate suitability for the role. The correct answer is D. Using the PI cognitive assessment as one component of a multifaceted evaluation, alongside interviews and reference checks, with results interpreted by trained personnel and integrated into a holistic assessment of candidate suitability for the role. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in ensuring the ethical and compliant use of a cognitive assessment tool, specifically the PI cognitive assessment, within a recruitment process. The challenge lies in balancing the employer's need to assess candidate suitability with the regulatory and ethical obligations to ensure fairness, prevent discrimination, and maintain data privacy. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that aligns with best practices and avoids potential legal and reputational risks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a holistic candidate evaluation that integrates assessment results with other relevant information, while also ensuring transparency and fairness. This aligns with the principles of responsible assessment, which emphasize using tools appropriately and in conjunction with other valid selection methods. It also implicitly addresses potential concerns about the assessment's validity and reliability for the specific role by not relying on it as the sole determinant of suitability. This approach fosters a fair and equitable recruitment process, minimizing the risk of adverse impact on protected groups and upholding the integrity of the selection process. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the PI cognitive assessment score to make a hiring decision fails to acknowledge the limitations of any single assessment tool and the potential for bias. This could lead to a violation of equal opportunity principles if the assessment has not been validated for the specific role and demographic, potentially resulting in discriminatory hiring practices. Another incorrect approach that involves sharing raw assessment scores with unqualified personnel or without proper consent violates data privacy regulations and ethical guidelines concerning the handling of sensitive candidate information. This exposes the organization to risks related to data breaches and misuse of personal data. A third incorrect approach that disregards the assessment results entirely, despite investing in the tool, represents an inefficient use of resources and an abdication of the responsibility to use available information to make informed hiring decisions. This can lead to suboptimal hiring outcomes and missed opportunities to identify suitable candidates. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the purpose and limitations of the PI cognitive assessment. This involves considering its validity and reliability for the specific role, and ensuring it is administered and interpreted by trained personnel. The next step is to integrate the assessment results with other relevant selection criteria, such as experience, qualifications, and interview performance, to form a comprehensive view of the candidate. Transparency with candidates about the assessment process and the use of their data is also crucial. Finally, regular review and validation of assessment practices are necessary to ensure ongoing compliance and effectiveness. Question 16. The risk matrix shows a statistically significant difference in PI cognitive assessment scores between two demographic groups for a critical role. The hiring manager is considering using these scores as a primary factor in selecting the top candidates. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliant approach? Option A. Conduct a job analysis to determine the essential cognitive skills required for the role and validate the PI cognitive assessment to ensure it measures these skills and is a business necessity, exploring less discriminatory alternatives if adverse impact is confirmed. Option B. Proceed with using the PI cognitive assessment scores as a primary selection factor, as the assessment is a standardized tool designed to measure cognitive ability. Option C. Adjust the PI cognitive assessment scores for the demographic group with lower average scores to mitigate the observed difference before using them in the selection process. Option D. Disregard the PI cognitive assessment results entirely due to the potential for adverse impact and rely solely on other selection methods. The correct answer is A. Conduct a job analysis to determine the essential cognitive skills required for the role and validate the PI cognitive assessment to ensure it measures these skills and is a business necessity, exploring less discriminatory alternatives if adverse impact is confirmed. Explanation. The scenario presents a challenge in interpreting the results of a PI cognitive assessment within a regulatory context, specifically concerning its application in a hiring decision. The core difficulty lies in balancing the assessment's predictive capabilities with the legal and ethical obligations to ensure fair and non-discriminatory hiring practices. The regulatory framework for such assessments, particularly in the U.S., emphasizes that while cognitive abilities are important, the assessment must not be used in a way that disadvantages protected groups or leads to disparate impact without a clear, job-related business necessity. Risk matrix in this context highlights potential areas of concern, such as a statistically significant difference in scores between demographic groups, which could trigger further scrutiny. The correct approach involves a nuanced interpretation of the PI cognitive assessment results, considering them as one component of a holistic evaluation. This approach prioritizes a thorough job analysis to establish the essential functions and required cognitive skills for the role. It then involves assessing whether the PI cognitive assessment accurately measures these job-related skills and whether its application results in adverse impact on any protected class. If adverse impact is identified, the next step is to determine if the assessment is a business necessity and if there are less discriminatory alternatives. This aligns with U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission (EOC) guidelines, which mandate that selection procedures that have an adverse impact on employment opportunities for any race, sex, or ethnic group must be validated to show they are job-related and consistent with business necessity. This approach ensures compliance with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, by focusing on job-relatedness and fairness. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the PI cognitive assessment scores to make a hiring decision, especially if the risk matrix indicates potential adverse impact. This could lead to a violation of anti-discrimination laws, as it might result in the exclusion of qualified candidates from protected groups without a demonstrable business necessity. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the PI cognitive assessment results entirely due to the presence of potential adverse impact, without first conducting a validation study or exploring less discriminatory alternatives. This could mean overlooking a valuable tool for assessing job-related cognitive abilities, potentially leading to less effective hiring decisions and failing to meet legitimate business needs. A third incorrect approach would be to attempt to adjust scores to mitigate adverse impact, as this is generally prohibited by EOC guidelines and can be seen as discriminatory in itself. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a systematic approach, 1. Understand the specific role and its cognitive requirements through a robust job analysis. 2. Evaluate the PI cognitive assessment's validity and reliability in measuring those specific job-related skills. 3. Analyze the assessment's impact on different demographic groups using the data from the risk matrix. 4. If adverse impact is present, conduct a thorough validation study to demonstrate business necessity. 5. Explore alternative selection methods that are less discriminatory but still effective in identifying qualified candidates. 6. Document all steps taken, analyses performed, and decisions made to ensure transparency and compliance. Question 17. Investigation of a candidate's suitability for a role using the PI cognitive assessment, where the assessment results indicate a certain level of cognitive ability, but the hiring manager is also aware of the candidate's undergraduate institution and their perceived drive based on resume content. The manager is considering how these external factors should influence the interpretation of the PI cognitive assessment scores. Option A. Interpret the PI cognitive assessment results solely based on their direct correlation with the cognitive demands of the role, without factoring in the candidate's undergraduate institution or perceived drive from their resume. Option B. Adjust the interpretation of the PI cognitive assessment results upwards if the candidate attended a prestigious undergraduate institution, assuming this indicates a higher underlying cognitive capacity. Option C. Use the PI cognitive assessment results as a secondary data point, prioritizing the candidate's perceived drive, and resume achievements as the primary indicators of potential success. Option D. Discount the PI cognitive assessment results if they do not immediately align with the initial impression formed from the candidate's resume, suggesting the assessment may not be accurately capturing the candidate's true abilities. The correct answer is A. Interpret the PI cognitive assessment results solely based on their direct correlation with the cognitive demands of the role, without factoring in the candidate's undergraduate institution or perceived drive from their resume. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the appropriate use and interpretation of cognitive assessment within a regulatory framework that prioritizes fairness and non-discrimination. The core difficulty lies in balancing the utility of a predictive assessment with the imperative to avoid introducing bias or making decisions based on factors outside the assessment's intended scope. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the assessment is used as a tool for understanding potential, not as a definitive judgment of an individual's worth or capability based on external, potentially irrelevant characteristics. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to the principles of ethical assessment administration and interpretation. Specifically, it focuses on the assessment's intended purpose to measure cognitive abilities relevant to job performance, and avoids drawing conclusions based on demographic information or assumptions about how cognitive ability might manifest in different groups. This aligns with regulatory guidelines that prohibit discrimination and mandate the use of assessments in a manner that is validated and job-related. By focusing solely on the assessment results and their direct implications for the role, the professional upholds principles of fairness and objectivity. An incorrect approach that considers the candidate's educational background as a primary factor in interpreting the PI cognitive assessment results fails to adhere to the assessment's psychometric properties and regulatory expectations. This approach risks introducing bias by assuming a correlation between educational pedigree and cognitive potential that may not be empirically supported by the assessment itself. It also deviates from best practice by relying on external, potentially subjective, factors rather than the objective data provided by the assessment. Another incorrect approach that uses the PI cognitive assessment results to infer personality traits or work ethic beyond what the assessment is designed to measure, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Cognitive assessments are designed to measure specific cognitive abilities, not broader personality constructs. Misinterpreting or overextending the scope of the assessment can lead to inaccurate evaluations, unfair decision-making, and potential legal challenges related to discriminatory practices. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of psychometric principles and the limitations of the assessment tool. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the PI cognitive assessment results due to a perceived lack of alignment with the candidate's resume, without a clear, job-related rationale, also presents a professional challenge. While it is important to consider the totality of a candidate's qualifications, Arbitrarily disregarding objective assessment data without a valid documented reason can be seen as subjective and potentially discriminatory. This approach fails to leverage the assessment as a tool for objective evaluation and may lead to decisions based on personal bias rather than a comprehensive, fair assessment process. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the assessment's purpose, psychometric properties, and limitations. Professionals must consult relevant regulatory guidelines and ethical codes to ensure fair and non-discriminatory application. The decision-making framework should prioritize objective data from validated assessments, consider all relevant information in a job-related context, and avoid making assumptions or drawing conclusions based on factors not directly measured by the assessment or not demonstrably linked to job performance. When in doubt, seeking guidance from assessment experts or legal counsel is advisable. Question 18. Analysis of a PI cognitive assessment report for a candidate reveals a profile that suggests strong analytical reasoning but a moderate score in attention to detail. The hiring manager is concerned about the latter, as the role requires meticulous data entry. Which approach best reflects responsible and ethical interpretation of this assessment data for risk assessment purposes? Option A. Immediately flag the moderate attention to detail score as a significant risk and recommend against proceeding with the candidate, as it directly contradicts a key requirement of the role. Option B. Focus exclusively on the attention to detail score, assuming it is an immutable trait that will inevitably lead to errors in data entry, and disregard the candidate's strong analytical reasoning. Option C. Interpret the moderate attention to detail score as an indication that the candidate is likely to be easily distracted and therefore unsuitable for any role requiring sustained focus, regardless of other cognitive strengths. Option D. Evaluate the candidate's overall cognitive profile, considering how their strong analytical reasoning might compensate for or be leveraged alongside their moderate attention to detail, and explore this further through targeted interview questions or a practical exercise relevant to the job's data entry demands. The correct answer is D. Evaluate the candidate's overall cognitive profile, considering how their strong analytical reasoning might compensate for or be leveraged alongside their moderate attention to detail, and explore this further through targeted interview questions or a practical exercise relevant to the job's data entry demands. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an individual is tasked with interpreting the results of a PI cognitive assessment for a candidate. The challenge lies in moving beyond a superficial understanding of the scores to a nuanced assessment of how those cognitive abilities might translate to job performance, while simultaneously adhering to ethical guidelines regarding assessment interpretation and avoiding discriminatory practices. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for misinterpretation to lead to unfair hiring decisions or to overlook a candidate's true potential. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a holistic review of the PI cognitive assessment results in conjunction with other relevant information, such as the job requirements and other assessment data. This aligns with best professional practice by recognizing that cognitive assessments are one piece of a larger puzzle. It emphasizes the importance of considering the candidate's strengths and potential areas for development in the context of the specific role, rather than making absolute judgments based solely on scores. This approach is ethically sound as it promotes fair and objective evaluation, minimizing the risk of bias. It also aligns with the principles of responsible assessment use, which advocate for the interpretation of results within a broader context and for a specific purpose. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely focusing on whether the candidate's scores meet a predefined threshold without considering the nuances of the role or the candidate's overall profile. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it can lead to the exclusion of potentially qualified candidates who might excel in the role despite not perfectly matching arbitrary score benchmarks. It risks creating a biased selection process. Another incorrect approach is to overemphasize a single low score as a definitive disqualifier without exploring mitigating factors or the candidate's ability to compensate through other strengths or learned strategies. This is ethically problematic as it can lead to unfair rejection and fails to acknowledge the complexity of human performance. A third incorrect approach is to make assumptions about a candidate's future performance based on generalized interpretations of cognitive profiles without specific validation for the role in question. This is a failure in professional judgment and can lead to discriminatory outcomes by stereotyping candidates. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach PI cognitive assessment interpretation by first understanding the specific cognitive abilities being measured and their relevance to the job role. They should then consider the candidate's scores in conjunction with other available data, such as interview performance, past experience, and situational judgment. The focus should be on identifying strengths that align with job requirements and potential areas where support or development might be beneficial. This process requires a commitment to fairness, objectivity, and a thorough understanding of the assessment's limitations and appropriate use. Question 19. The efficiency study reveals that a candidate for a critical role has a strong potential for success based on preliminary screening. The designated administrator for the PI cognitive assessment is a close personal friend of this candidate. Given the importance of an unbiased evaluation for this role, what is the most appropriate course of action to maintain the integrity of the PI cognitive assessment process? Option A. The designated administrator should proceed with administering the PI cognitive assessment, ensuring they remain strictly objective and neutral throughout the process. Option B. The PI cognitive assessment should be administered by an independent, uninvolved party to ensure objectivity and adherence to best practices for assessment validity. Option C. The candidate's PI cognitive assessment should be waived due to the potential for bias, and their suitability should be determined solely by other assessment methods. Option D. The designated administrator should administer the PI cognitive assessment, but make a note of their personal relationship in the assessment report to acknowledge potential bias. Correct answer is A. The designated administrator should proceed with administering the PI cognitive assessment, ensuring they remain strictly objective and neutral throughout the process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for objective assessment with the potential for bias introduced by familiarity. The Predictive Index Cognitive Assessment, PICA, is designed to measure cognitive abilities objectively. However, the context of its application, particularly when a familiar individual is involved, necessitates a rigorous adherence to the assessment's intended use and the ethical guidelines governing its administration. The challenge lies in ensuring the integrity of the assessment process and the validity of its results, preventing personal relationships from influencing the interpretation or application of the scores. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the standardized administration and objective interpretation of the PICA, as mandated by the assessment's design and the ethical principles of psychometric testing. This involves ensuring that the individual administering the assessment is not personally acquainted with the candidate, thereby mitigating any potential for unconscious bias or undue influence. Adhering to the PICA's guidelines for administration and interpretation, which typically stipulate the need for a neutral administrator, is crucial for maintaining the validity and reliability of the assessment results. This upholds the professional responsibility to provide accurate and unbiased data for decision-making. An incorrect approach that involves administering the PICA to a candidate known personally to the administrator fails to uphold professional standards. This constitutes a regulatory and ethical failure because it compromises the objectivity of the assessment. The administrator's familiarity could lead to subtle biases in their observation, interpretation of nonverbal cues, or even in the way they present the assessment, all of which can distort the candidate's true cognitive profile. This violates the core principle of fair and equitable assessment, potentially leading to inaccurate conclusions about the candidate's capabilities and unfair employment decisions. Another incorrect approach, which involves proceeding with the assessment but attempting to compensate for familiarity through subjective adjustments, is also professionally unacceptable. This is an ethical failure because it introduces a layer of subjective interpretation that is not supported by the PICA's psychometric properties. The assessment is designed to be administered and scored in a standardized manner. Attempting to correct for perceived bias through personal judgment undermines the scientific basis of the assessment and introduces further unquantifiable variables, rendering the results unreliable and potentially discriminatory. The professional reasoning process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the PICA's administration protocols and ethical guidelines. When a potential conflict of interest arises due to familiarity, The professional must first identify this conflict. The next step is to consult the official documentation and guidelines for the PICA to determine the prescribed course of action. If the guidelines explicitly prohibit administration by a familiar party, or strongly recommend against it, the professional decision must be to recuse themselves or arrange for an independent administrator. This decision-making framework prioritizes the integrity of the assessment process and the ethical treatment of the candidate, ensuring that decisions are based on valid and reliable data. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows that an individual scored within the top quartile on the PI cognitive assessment, indicating a strong capacity for learning and problem solving. When assessing the potential risk associated with this individual taking on a complex, rapidly evolving project, which interpretation best informs the risk assessment? Option A. The individual's high cognitive ability indicates a potential for overthinking problems, thereby increasing the risk of project delays. Option B. The individual's top quartile score guarantees successful project completion and eliminates any possibility of project-related risks. Option C. The individual's high cognitive ability suggests a lower likelihood of encountering significant challenges in adapting to project changes and a reduced risk of making critical errors due to cognitive limitations. Option D. The individual's cognitive assessment score is irrelevant to the actual risks encountered during project execution, as only experience matters. The correct answer is C. The individual's high cognitive ability suggests a lower likelihood of encountering significant challenges in adapting to project changes and a reduced risk of making critical errors due to cognitive limitations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret the results of a cognitive assessment not just for their face value, but for their potential implications in a high-stakes decision-making context. The challenge lies in moving beyond a simple understanding of the assessment's output to a nuanced appreciation of how that output informs risk. The Predictive Index Cognitive Assessment, PICA, is designed to measure an individual's ability to learn, problem solve, and adapt to change. When used in a risk assessment context, it's crucial to understand that a higher score generally indicates a greater capacity for these cognitive functions, which can translate to a lower risk of errors, poor judgment, or inability to adapt to evolving circumstances. Conversely, a lower score might suggest a higher potential for these risks. The professional must therefore consider the asterisk implications of the cognitive profile for the specific role or situation, rather than just reporting the score. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly links the assessment's findings to a practical risk evaluation. By considering the cognitive profile in relation to the demands of the role or situation, the professional is engaging in a forward-looking assessment of potential future performance and associated risks. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide advice that is relevant, actionable, and grounded in a comprehensive understanding of the assessment's purpose and limitations. It demonstrates a commitment to using assessment data responsibly to inform decisions that impact individuals and organizations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the raw score without contextualization fails to acknowledge the purpose of a cognitive assessment in risk assessment. It is a superficial interpretation that ignores the underlying cognitive abilities being measured and their relevance to practical outcomes. This can lead to misjudgments and potentially unfair or ineffective decisions. Another incorrect approach that overemphasizes the assessment as a definitive predictor of future behavior without acknowledging the influence of other factors is also problematic. Cognitive assessments are one piece of a larger puzzle. They do not eliminate all other variables that contribute to performance and risk. Relying solely on the PICA score to predict success or failure without considering experience, training, situational context, or other behavioral indicators would be a failure to conduct a thorough and balanced risk assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multifaceted approach. First, understand the specific context and the nature of the risk being assessed. Second, interpret the cognitive assessment results in light of that context, considering what the scores imply about an individual's capacity for learning, problem-solving, and adaptation relevant to the situation. Third, integrate the cognitive assessment findings with other relevant information, such as experience, past performance, and situational factors, to form a holistic view of the risk. Finally, communicate the findings and their implications clearly and responsibly, acknowledging the limitations of any single assessment tool.